Hello, welcome back to Aubrey Washington Film. Today I'm going to be reviewing the movie The Devil Wears Prada because I recently rewatched it before I go see The Devil Wears Prada 2, and I walked away with a different perspective than I did the first time that I watched it. So, of course, if you have not seen this somehow, there will be spoilers, so go ahead and see it, but here we go. The very first time that I watched this movie, I was remembering the outfits, the fashion, the comedy, and of course, Miranda being very intimidating. But rewatching it as an adult, and especially watching it through the lens of film criticism, I realized that this movie is doing something much deeper than people may give it credit for. This movie isn't really about fashion, it's about ambition, it's about identity, and it's also about adapting to survive. Most importantly, it's about what happens when success starts changing who you actually are. And one thing that I noticed immediately was how relatable Andy's situation actually is. Most people are never going to work for a major fashion magazine or walk around in designer clothing all the time. But almost everyone has experienced entering a new environment where they feel completely out of place. So maybe it's a new job, maybe it's college, maybe it's a new city, maybe it's a promotion. Whatever it is, most people have experienced walking into a room and realizing that everyone seems to understand the rules except them, and that's Andy. So she enters this world with qualifications to actually be there, but she doesn't understand the culture, and that becomes the emotional center of the entire film. The opening establishes that immediately, and one thing that I think that the movie does extremely well is showing the pressure before Miranda even ever appears on the screen. So everyone is nervous, everyone's running around, and everyone's acting like one wrong move could destroy their career. But before Miranda says even a single word, the audience already understands her influence. Contrastly, Andy walks into this environment completely unaware of who Miranda is. And at first, that almost works in her favor because she isn't trying to impress Miranda like other people and other people that have worked for Miranda because she doesn't truly fully understand the significance of who she's talking to. She just wants a job. So Miranda, despite all the chaos surrounding her, really just wants someone that's reliable. So right away at the very beginning of the film, the workplace hierarchy is already established. So it establishes a fear of failure, and it adds pressure as well on many sides and many characters very early on. And most importantly to me, it establishes ambition disguised as survival because almost everyone in the building is trying to stay relevant, stay employed, or move up within the company. The pacing moves quickly, but I never felt lost. And the stakes are very clear. You understand the environment and you also understand what Andy is up against. But I think where the movie becomes interesting is what happens after Andy begins changing. So at the beginning of the film, she rejects the fashion world completely. She even laughs at it. Her friends laugh at it. Her boyfriend dismisses it. And everyone treats the fashion industry like it's superficial and unimportant, despite living in New York City, by the way. So Andy sees the job just as something temporary, something that she has to survive before moving on to what she considers a more serious career, and then something changes. So this is where I think the movie is really asking its central question. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice for success? And after Andy struggles repeatedly at work, she stops resisting the culture around her and actually starts studying it and adapting to it. And that adaptation begins externally. So you see her clothing change. She starts, going to only wearing designer clothing and designer heels, and her appearance change and her confidence changes. And what I found interesting is that the wardrobe transformation isn't really about clothing in this film. It's more so about identity. So every outfit that Andy wore represents her becoming more accepted within her job, more respected and more valued. And you could see that once people start validating her, she starts beginning to want more and more and more validation. So I think it's one of the most realistic aspects of the film because people like approval. People like being recognized and people like feeling successful. So the movie shows just how quickly that can become addictive. So one of the symbols that I noticed most during this rewatch is Andy's phone. It never stops ringing. There's always another demand from Miranda. There's always another task. There's always another expectation. There's always another emergency. The phone almost becomes a symbol for workplace pressure and the idea that your job now owns your time. So the more successful Andy becomes within her job with Miranda, the more disconnected she becomes from the people around her. And this dynamic alone is probably one of the smartest parts of the film because Miranda and Andy slowly become reflections of each other. At first, Andy judges Miranda completely. She thinks she's cold, disconnected, and she thinks that Miranda prioritizes work over everything else. But as the story progresses, Andy starts making many of those same choices, and she misses important events. She misses work. She creates distance between herself and people who care about her, and she starts seeing success differently than she did before. And then Miranda says something that changes the entire movie. She tells Andy that she sees herself in her. And that line is very important because it confirms what the audience has already been watching happen. Andy isn't just working for Miranda anymore. She's becoming more and more like Miranda. And that creates one of the most interesting questions in the entire film. Does success isolate people, or does success simply reveal who people are actually becoming? So I don't think the movie really gives a definitive answer, and I think that's probably intentional because there are many moments where Andy's friends frustrate me as a viewer because the film almost forces viewers to ask whether Andy's support system was concerned about her happiness or uncomfortable with her growth. And that is a very different conversation. There's a scene where Andy is sharing opportunities, gifts, and experiences with the people around her, yet they increasingly become more and more critical of her choices. So the movie never really tells us who's right or who's wrong, which I actually do appreciate hindsight because life usually isn't that simple, right? Another thing that stood out to me was how visually immersive the movie was. So the fashion world feels real, the pressure feels real, and the conversations also feel real. They don't feel like fake or like, you're having to kind of shift your mindset to make it believable. Everything from the clothing to the offices to the pacing helps build this environment where image equals power. And the close-up conversations create tension even when people aren't raising their voices. And Miranda's calmness is actually what makes her intimidating in this film. Most movie villains yell, right? Most intimidating characters explode emotionally, but Miranda rarely does. She's very controlled, and because she's controlled, everyone else becomes very nervous. Meryl Streep understood exactly what that role needed. She doesn't dominate scenes because she's loud. She dominates scenes because everyone else reacts to her presence alone. Anne Hathaway also deserves a lot of credit because Andy stays relatable throughout the entire movie. Even when she's changing, you still understand why she's changing and also how she's changing. And that's important because if viewers stop relating to Andy, then the movie just stops working. So there are a few places where I do feel the film struggles. Some scenes involving Andy's friends do feel repetitive. I understand why they're there, because each scene to scene to scene, there's different energy, right, from Andy and her friends. It makes sense that the movie needs to show how much she's actually changing. But compared to the workplace storyline, these scenes sometimes lose momentum. And Christian's character is another example. So he feels manipulative almost immediately, which removes some type of complexity from the choices Andy eventually makes. And I do think that some of the emotional consequences move a little too quickly. The movie asks a lot of fascinating questions that it doesn't fully explore. Can ambition and relationships coexist? Is Miranda actually happy? Was Andy wrong for changing? Or did she simply outgrow certain people? I found myself thinking about those questions after the movie ended, and for me, that's usually a sign of a very successful film. The best movies don't just entertain you, they give you something to think about afterwards, which brings me to the themes. So, when people talk about The Devil Wears Prada, they usually talk about fashion, but I think the real themes are sacrifice, conformity, identity, ambition, status, and fear of failure. Every major character sacrifices something, and Miranda sacrifices relationships. Emily sacrifices her health and her self-worth. Andy sacrifices authenticity for a period of time. Nate, Andy's boyfriend, sacrifices patience and understanding. And everyone is trading something for the life that they want. And that's what makes the movie so relatable. Most people, again, will never work in fashion, but most people understand sacrifice, pressure, and also wanting approval. So I will say that the older that I get, the less that this movie feels like a fashion comedy and the more it feels like a workplace drama about identity. And I think that that's why it's remained relevant for so long. The conversation about burnout, ambition, work-life balance, image, and success culture is probably even more relevant now than it was when the movie first came out. So what starts as a stylish comedy slowly becomes a story about how environments shape people, and whether adapting is growth, compromise, or some type of combination of both. So overall, I gave The Devil Wears Prada a 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5 for the story, 5 out of 5 for acting, 5 out of 5 for emotional impact, and 5 out of 5 for rewatch value. And my final takeaway is simple. The Devil Wears Prada isn't really about fashion. It's about what happens when ambition starts changing your identity. So if you've watched this film, let me know your thoughts. I will be going to see The Devil Wears Prada 2 very soon, so be on the lookout for that review. But thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for watching.